Nellie 1983, the forgotten massacre in Indian history. Within 6 hours, 14 villages were surrounded and attacked. More than 2,000 people, mostly women and children of Bengali Muslim origin, were brutally murdered with machetes, clubs and fire. No one had time to run. No one was warned. This is the Nellie Massacre, one of the darkest chapters in modern Indian history. A tragedy with no verdict, no justice, no formal apology. And today, we take you back to that morning, to understand how a community was wiped out simply because they had different blood. And why, more than 4 decades later, the case remains unsolved. Assam, a state in northeastern India, is a land of ancient rivers, green tea plantations, and ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse communities. But in the midst of its peacefulness for many years before 1983, a hidden conflict had been brewing. This year, many Bengali Muslim families, immigrants from Bangladesh or West Bengal, have settled in Morrigan, Nagaon, and riverside villages. They reclaimed land, grew rice, built houses, had children. They lived simply, had nothing to do with politics. But they were always considered outsiders, always seen as coming to occupy the land. One of the typical families living in Borbori village is the family of Mr. Abdul Rahman, 45 years old, farmer, Muslim. He has a wife named Shakira, 3 sons and a daughter. The small wooden house with terracotta walls is where they have lived for more than 15 years. Every day, Mr. Rahman wakes up at dawn, carries a hoe to the field. Mrs. Shakira weaves, makes curd, and tends the vegetable garden. The children go to school in the village school, more than a kilometer away. The whole family lives by their hands, their bent backs, and their simple faith in the earth. None of them knew that the land they plowed every day would be the place where they fell. No one expected that the neighbors who used to drink tea and borrow knives from them would be the ones holding weapons and entering their yard. In the early months of 1983, life in the villages around Nellie continued with a familiar calm. Despite sporadic protests in the distance, in the city, or at polling stations, people here still believed that the political storm would not touch their small village. Abdul Rahman still goes to the fields every day. He has a rice field on the edge of the Kapili River, where he stands watching the water flow and thinking about his children's future. Shakira gets up before the sun rises, lights the fire, and brews ginger tea. They are not rich, but they keep their small house warm. The children, 3 boys and a girl. The oldest is in 6th grade, the youngest is 4. They often play around the bamboo bushes behind the house, where there is a beehive and an old hammock that Mr. Rahman woven himself. The villagers of Borbori, Madi Purbet, Alasinga, despite their different origins, could still live side by side. The native Assamese, the immigrant Bengali, still went to the market together, drank tea together at the village entrance. But what people don't see is that beneath the surface of calm, a political storm is brewing. Anti-immigration sentiment is spreading. Extremist groups in Assam started talking about land grabs, about foreigners snatching away the right to vote. The hostility seeped into every small talk, every wary glance. Extremist groups in Assam started talking about land grabs, about foreigners snatching away the right to vote. The hostility seeped into every small talk, every wary glance. And while those spears of hatred were being sharpened, Abdul Rahman's family and thousands of other families lived carefree, unaware that they had long been marked like silent prey in the wilderness. February 16, 1983, in the outskirts of Nagaon district, word began to spread that the upcoming general elections would be held in a state of unrest. Protest groups. Assam has announced a boycott of the election, threatening to stop foreigners from voting at all costs. On the night of the 16th, screams were heard from the distant hills. Some houses in Borbori village said they heard footsteps and people whispering in the forest. But no one dared to leave their houses to check. People just locked their doors tighter and prayed harder. On the night of the 16th, screams were heard from the distant hills. Some houses in Borbori village said they heard footsteps and people whispering in the forest. But no one dared to leave their houses to check. People just locked their doors tighter and prayed harder. That afternoon, Abdul Rahman took his eldest son to the fields to weed, while Shakira prepared dinner. They talked about the upcoming harvest, about repairing the roof when the rains came. No one in the family or the village thought that this would be their last night together. On the evening of the 17th, a few frightened young Bengalis walked to the nearest police station, more than 5 kilometers away, to report the threat. They said that groups of men with knives and sticks had been seen gathering near the forest. But they were told to go home and calm down. No force was sent. No warning was given. That night, many people in the village did not sleep. They stayed awake quietly in the dark, holding their children close, listening to the wind whistling outside the door. And just as they feared, that was the last peaceful night of the village. Around 6 a.m., February 18, 1983, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the thick fog, the Nellie village watchman reported strange movements from the woods. But by then, it was too late. Hundreds, even thousands of men appeared from 4 directions: the edge of the forest, the dirt roads, and the river, carrying knives, sticks, spears, and some even had homemade guns. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but they moved in clear formations, with someone in command, someone giving the order to attack. Borbori village was the first to be ambushed. Groups of young men were attacked as they went out to the fields. Many collapsed in their yards, hacked to pieces. Women and children fled into their homes and into the woods, but nowhere was safe. Abdul Rahman's house was surrounded within minutes. As he tried to flee with his wife and children through the back door, a group of men blocked his way. They said nothing. One of the men, later identified as a resident of a neighboring village, was the first to strike. Rahman fell, carrying his youngest child. Shakira and the 3 remaining children barricaded themselves inside the house, but the fire was lit from both ends. The house burned to the sound of screams for help. There were no survivors. It was not just Borbori. Other villages like Madi Purbet, Alasinga, Nellie, and Kalapara were also attacked at almost the same time. The attackers were divided into small groups. Each group was in charge of a different area. Some of them even carried kerosene to burn houses and destroy crops. Bodies were found in rivers, wells, barns, even rice fields. Many children were hacked to death in their mothers' arms. Some pregnant women were killed in such brutal ways that investigators later refused to record the details. A total of 14 villages were attacked over a period of about 6 hours. Official reports put the death toll at more than 2,191, but independent groups say the real figure could be as high as 3,000. A total of 14 villages were attacked over a period of about 6 hours. Official reports put the death toll at more than 2,191, but independent groups say the real figure could be as high as 3,000. As the clock struck 1 p.m., the attackers withdrew, leaving behind a devastated village and scattered corpses. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of blood. No one spoke. The survivors quietly left their hiding places, stunned by the scene before them: blood-red rice fields, burnt houses, and piled-up corpses. A 13-year-old boy named Kareem, who escaped into the forest, took a shortcut across the river to reach the Batadraba police station, nearly 5 kilometers away. Scratched, hungry, thirsty, and out of breath, he was the first to tell the authorities what had happened. Within an hour, the news spread. Local police, border guards, and then Central Forces units were dispatched to the scene. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. The dead were dead. The killer had disappeared. In Borbori, they found the body of Abdul Rahman lying on top of his son. In Madi Purbet, the charred body of a pregnant woman next to 3 children. In the village of Alasinga, The entire population was killed. Not a single person was left alive. The Assam government was forced to report to the central government. The Delhi newspapers immediately reported, "Massacre in Assam, over 2,000 dead in one morning." International reporters also began to arrive. But when the cameras were turned on, the bodies had already begun to decompose. Spring temperatures of 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, turned the scene into a medical emergency. People secretly buried their loved ones in their yards for fear of spreading the disease. And so one of the bloodiest massacres in modern Indian history was discovered. But only discovered, not stopped, not saved. No one was there in time to stop the killer. No sirens. No reinforcements. As soon as police and border guards arrived at the scene, an urgent investigation was launched. However, the scale of the massacre, the harsh weather conditions, and the rapid decomposition made the task almost impossible. In Borbori village, where the number of bodies was highest, forensic officers worked amid a pungent stench and gruesome scenes. Bodies piled on top of each other, burned, hacked apart. Some were unrecognizable, with only scorched clothes and fragments of skulls remaining. More than 2,000 bodies were found scattered across 14 villages. Some had been herded into houses and set on fire. Some had been murdered while trying to cross rivers. In many cases, entire families, from grandparents to young children, lay dead side by side. Due to manpower shortages, the Assam government had to call in doctors and paramedics from neighboring districts. But there were no modern forensic equipment, no refrigerators to store the bodies, no autopsy rooms. Everything was done outdoors, under the hot sun, on blood-soaked ground. Many of the bodies were marked with white chalk, roughly numbered on cardboard, photographed with film cameras, and then transported to Guwahati for storage. But most of the bodies were then buried in mass graves without names or headstones. A later medical report, though not widely released, stated that more than 80% of the victims died from sharp objects, mainly slashes to the head, neck, and back. Some of the bodies showed signs of torture and mutilation. In many cases, women were raped before being killed. However, no autopsy records were ever included in the case file. There was no formal forensic examination as evidence for the prosecution. And so, what was recorded exists only as an archival document, forever unusable in any court of law. As soon as the scale of the massacre was confirmed, the Indian government was forced to form a special investigation team involving the Assam police, central forces, and domestic intelligence agencies. This is considered one of the biggest criminal investigations in the history of Assam. What followed, however, was not an exemplary investigation. On the contrary, it was a long series of confusion, inertia, lack of transparency, and abuse of power. In the early days, the investigation team collected statements from survivors, mostly women and children. They named the attackers, often people from nearby villages, some of whom they knew by face, even by the names of their parents. But when the list of suspects was drawn up, most were not immediately arrested. Some of the suspects had close ties to Assamese nationalist groups, or even local cadres. Those names were temporarily shelved to protect political stability, according to an internal directive that was never made public. One of the most serious efforts was the setting up of the Tiwari Commission, an independent investigation agency appointed by the central government. Over a year, the commission collected 600 statements, 100 crime scene reports, hundreds of forensic photographs and forensic documents. But much of the information was kept in secret files, no public release, no prosecution. Meanwhile, in Assam, civil and political forces used the massacre to bargain for power with the central government. They used the Nellie deaths as a bargaining chip in political negotiations. Between 1983 and 1985, more than 688 case files were filed, listing some 600 suspects. However, only about 15 people were ever arrested. most of whom were released after a few days due to lack of evidence. Many investigators expressed frustration, and some resigned. One unnamed forensic officer said, "We know the killer's name. They know we know. But no one will let us do anything." To make matters worse, in 1985, the Assam Accord was signed between the Indian government and nationalist groups. It included a clause that suspended all cases relating to ethnic unrest before August 1985. This meant that all 688 cases relating to the Nellie Massacre were frozen forever. There was no indictment. And no sentence was handed down. The investigation, rather than delivering justice, has become a bitter example of how politics can suppress the truth and stifle the voices of the innocent. Under pressure from national and international public opinion, the Assam government was forced to make some arrests in March 1983. However, this process was carried out in a very complicated context. Assamese society was deeply divided, and the security forces were facing a situation of resistance to orders. In the first 3 months after the massacre, about 50 people were temporarily detained. Most of them were farmers, powerless youths, identified by eyewitness accounts or suspected because they appeared near the scene. However, many of them were held for only a few days, then released for familiar reasons: lack of physical evidence, no direct witnesses, or because of the risk of further inflaming the local ethnic situation. Ironically, it was those who were identified by name by survivors, even describing their facial features and accents, who were never arrested. Individuals with social status, political connections, or connections to local militia groups were virtually immune from criminal responsibility. At some points, such as Decking and Batadraba police stations, arrest records show cases of mislabeled names, incorrect dates of birth, or confusion between suspects and witnesses. Some were detained for weeks and then released without explanation as to why they were arrested. An independent survey by the human rights organization People's Union for Democratic Rights, PUDR, in 1984 noted, of the 688 suspects named in the investigation file, only a maximum of 10 people had been detained for more than 7 days, and no one had been formally prosecuted. On the contrary, some survivors who testified were harassed. At least 4 female witnesses identified the killers of their husbands and children, and then had their homes burned down, had to leave Assam, and never returned. The arrest, in effect, became an administrative procedure, not meant to serve justice, but to appease public opinion. A symbolic formality. A legal drama that lasted for months, then fell silent. After making the temporary arrests, the investigation force entered the stage of taking statements and interrogating. This is considered an important step to determine the roles, motives, and connections between the suspects, thereby outlining the chain of organizations behind the massacre. But the reality was completely opposite to expectations. The interrogation process, the backbone of a criminal investigation, was disjointed, unsystematic, and almost useless. In many police stations, suspects are questioned without proper written records. Statements are handwritten in Assamese, while some suspects speak only Bengali, leading to inaccuracies, misunderstandings, or deliberate misrepresentations. One investigator later admitted, "We took statements on a form. We asked a few questions, wrote a few lines, then signed. There was no video, no audio. What happened in the interrogation room, only the walls and ceiling witnessed it." Some suspects said they were gathered in advance, divided into groups, given knives, and given clear instructions by the village chief. They said someone came to each house the night before the massacre, telling them to take action tomorrow morning. But no one in the investigation team actively tracked down the masterminds. On the other hand, the survivors' statements were not properly taken into account. A woman named Aisha Begum, 32, said that her neighbor Purna hacked her husband to death in front of her eyes, but no one called Purna to testify. There was no cross-examination. There was no further investigation. Worse, many witnesses feel threatened. They testify once, then do not dare to come to the police station again. Some are warned to keep quiet if you want to live in peace. And in some cases, the police themselves pressure victims to withdraw their statements. Testimony, the light of justice, has been stifled by fear, laziness, and political compromise. The heartbreaking words of survivors are never heard enough. And those who confess to murder still walk around with their heads held high as if nothing had happened. After a series of questioning and interrogation sessions that lasted throughout 1983 and early 1984, the investigation force entered what was considered the most important phase: compiling and consolidating the prosecution case. In legal theory, this is the stage where the justice system will puzzle the pieces: testimony, crime scene evidence, witness identification, to create a complete picture that convicts the suspect. Yet the Nellie case file, with more than 2,000 deaths, is chaotic, loose, and suspiciously vague. A total of 688 minor cases were opened, corresponding to each area, each village cluster that was attacked. A list of more than 600 suspects was drawn up. But most of the files stopped at the level of confessions. There was no physical evidence, no forensic identification, no independent expert analysis. Part of the reason is the chaos that followed the massacre. Bodies were hastily buried, crime scenes were disturbed, evidence disappeared or was not collected. But the other, deeper part is a deliberate abandonment. Many local legal officials, instead of pushing for prosecution, cited technical difficulties, social pressure, and insufficient grounds for prosecution under current regulations. Despite dozens of witnesses pointing the finger at the perpetrator, no further investigative measures were taken. Some files were lost. Some were quietly withdrawn, without notice. Some were later discovered to have been falsified. The forensic records, which should have been the backbone, were never properly prepared. Human rights lawyers who approached the case later called it a systematic perversion of justice, because the entire process of building a case, rather than leading to prosecution, became a preparation for doing nothing. By the end of 1984, almost all 688 files were complete at the level of available for trial if necessary. But no court was opened. No files were sent to the prosecutor's office. And in August 1985, when the Assam Accord was signed, the government officially declared that all cases relating to ethnic unrest during the period 1979 to 1985 would be closed in the interest of peace. The Nellie files were sealed, and justice sealed forever. In any civilized justice system, after a massacre with thousands of victims, the inevitable would be public trial, full prosecution, transparent sentencing. But for the Nellie Massacre, that never happened. From 1983 to 1985, victims and survivors waited. They held on to painful memories, carried documents between police stations, sought justice in cold interrogation rooms. But no one was called to testify in court. No trial was held. The Assam judiciary, under clear political influence, delayed the initiation of the case for 2 years. Every time a group of lawyers requested that the case be opened, they were met with responses such as insufficient evidence, no venue yet, or worse, silence. The climax was on the 15th of August 1985, when the central government signed the Assam Accord with local nationalist forces. One of the political bargaining terms was that all cases related to ethnic riots during the period 1979-1985 would be suspended to calm the situation and ensure social stability. Specifically, 688 cases related to the Nellie Massacre were closed. All suspects were exonerated. All witnesses were no longer called. All files were sealed. No trials, no indictments, no sentences were handed down. And so the entire legal process from investigation to trial ended in silence. no truth was revealed. No perpetrators were brought to justice. The Nellie Massacre, in which more than 2,000 people died, has never been formally tried in the Indian judicial system. A painful truth, a slap in the face to justice, a dark chapter in history hastily folded and filed away. More than 40 years have passed since that bloody morning in Nellie. The villages are now empty wastelands. The children who survived are now adults with memories that cannot be erased. But their loved ones never returned. Abdul Rahman's family, all 6 of them, did not survive. They were buried in a mass grave with no names, no photographs. Only a small stone with the inscription, "Victims of Hatred." More than 2,000 families have lost loved ones. But what they have lost is not just their lives, it is their faith. Faith in the law, in government, in justice. This massacre is not just the history of Assam. It is a lesson for all of us, of any country, any people. That indifference to injustice is complicity. That silence in the face of wrongdoing is invisible complicity. Today, when you pass through that land, you can still hear the wind blowing through the rice fields and see the morning dew covering the roofs. But to those who remember, Nellie will never be an ordinary place. It is a symbol of one thing: if justice is not protected, then none of us are truly safe.